So a couple more things. Um, you should have your microphone turned off automatically when you joined, but if not, I'll just ask that you keep the mics muted during this, unless you're asking a question, because sometimes we've had some issues with feedback in the past. So that would be helpful. So we are here to celebrate the release of Dave Cook's book, Dark Tales of the Eno. I've gotten to look through it a little bit. We've got some copies at the office, and it's just a fantastically written book and a really wide-ranging compilation of stories. So I'm going to encourage everyone to check that out. If you'd like to get a copy, they're going fast, but there might be some left. I'm putting a link to the our website where you can order a copy here in the chat. So please hop over there and do that before they're all gone. Um, Also, stay tuned for there will be an in-person fireside storytelling also from the book with Dave sometime in April. I think it's around the 17th, but we will have to cap the registration for that. So stay tuned. Probably late March, early April. The sign up for that will be released. We're looking forward to that. Um, with that, we'll get started. I'm going to introduce Dave, and then we'll be off to the races here. Um, so welcome to this Lunch and Learn. We like to do these a few times each year when it's too cold and miserable to be outside for programming. Um, and this is a special edition because we have a guest speaker, um, Dave Cook. So Dave is a native North Carolinian, born and raised in Chapel Hill. He was a park ranger at four parks, Falls Lake, Morrow Mountain, Eno River, and Hanging Rock, finishing up his 30-year career as a district superintendent supporting 9 state parks. From there, he worked briefly for the Ellerby Creek Watershed Association, then for more than 4 years as the education director for the Eno River Association. Since leaving the association, he has continued to volunteer for the Eno, and Dave has been and continues to be involved in church, the Boy Scouts, search and rescue, fishing, exploring wilderness, and trying to learn the guitar. And I'll just say personally, having had the pleasure of being out in the field with Dave a few times, he is just such a wealth of knowledge about all things Eno, from the human history to the flora and fauna. And I'm just thrilled that we've been able to have him here today for this Lunch and Learn. I think that this is going to be a lot of fun and really informative and interesting. So with that, thank you, Dave, and thanks you all for coming. And I will turn it over to Dave Cook.
Thanks, Eli. That was a real nice introduction. I appreciate that. So I'm going to tell you guys some stories from the book. Don't worry about that. You're going to hopefully be entertained by that. But I really want to start out just tell everybody briefly how this book came about, the story behind that. So when I was education director for the association, well, let's go back for that. As a ranger for Eno River, I started accumulating some stories, and just a few here and there of death, disaster, murder, mystery, mayhem, those kind of things. And those were just floating around in my head most of the time. When I became the education director over at the Eno River Association, I started kicking around the idea of my head of doing exactly what we're going to do in April, which is having like a fireside program and telling stories. And I just started making a list of the ones that I could remember, and I had about a dozen and a half that I put together. And I approached our development director, Emily Hill, at the time. And I said, Emily, we could do this program. It could be a members only program. We could charge a little bit, make a little money for our land conservation efforts, and just have a good thing for our membership, something to encourage people to join the Eno River Association. And she thought that was a great idea. In an hour's program, I could probably tell 4 or 5 good stories. And we do it around a campfire at night. And so we planned some dates. We packed 2 dates so people could come and be the same program. But we planned it for the springtime. And we got the place over at Eno River State Park. We're going to do one out at the group camp around the campfire, one at the picnic area in case people had mobility issues. Well, we were planning that in January of 2020. And if you remember what happened a few weeks into January 2020, society shut down. So about as soon as we had it planned, it was canceled. We couldn't get groups of people together anymore. And so, I was kind of lost with all these stories I had and didn't want to lose them. Of course, we were busy with things. We actually produced a couple of them on video. So if you go to the iHeart the Eno channel, you can see a couple of stories from the book, and where you can actually see on site where these stories took place and get the narration for those as well. And in some cases, more photographs of the actual events that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Well, so we proceeded through that. And so when that didn't happen, I was really hating that these stories were going to get lost. And that's when the germ of the idea of maybe I should try to start writing them down. Could there be a book to deal with this? Well, what you may not know also is during this time, it was actually turned out to be a very dark time in my life because during 2020, my wife, first of all, was diagnosed with breast cancer, had a serious leg injury, and then was diagnosed with ALS. And so I was becoming her primary caregiver. And at the end of 2020, had to step back at the first day of 2021, really, and stay home and start taking care of her. But that did help lead to this book. So when she was basically losing some of her mobility. I was having to be her driver. Well, the Eno River Association, actually, even before I left the Eno River Association, did something very nice. She had to stop working as a nurse, and she became the online Eno River Association store manager. She would be the one that would come into the association office in the basement, and when y'all would place orders, she would fulfill those orders. Once I stopped working there, I was her driver and I'd come in. I was her mandatory volunteer and basically get things off the shelves and stuff for her. But for those of you who don't know, down in the basement of the association office is the written archives and the photographic archives of the association. So while she was doing a lot of her administrative work, I started going through the archives, finding more stories, more newspaper articles, written stories, photographs, stuff like that. So I started researching more, and then I got into more research at the Durham Library and the Orange County Library, and the whole idea of this book started coming together because there were stories just coming out everywhere. 67 of them made them in the book. There's another 18 because the History Press doesn't have, they have a formula of how long the book's going to be. I had to cut out 18 stories. And so there were stories everywhere that were cropping up. I got on newspapers.com and, I went to courthouses, I went to state park records, I just all kinds of things, got people's oral histories and put this together. And so that's how the book came together. And I did most of the writing while I was taking care of my wife, many times sitting at the ALS clinic at Duke University because it was like 6 hour days in between doctors. I'd be sitting there with my computer typing stories, and it eventually led to this. The book is dedicated to her. She has since passed, but so much of the Eno was through our lives, and I just wanted to do that. So that's how the book came about. And I'm glad it's here. It takes a while to get it actually through the publisher and out. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, let's see here if I can get there we go. That's what I was trying to get to. All right. So this is what you guys really wanted. You guys didn't want to hear me rattle on. You wanted to hear stories about the Eno. And so I've got some notes here. I'm going to refer to them, but I'm going to wander off the notes quite a bit to tell you some of more of the backstory and other details that couldn't get into the book. So the first story I'm going to tell you is about Betty Riley, who was found murdered in a backyard on her house on Guest Road. And you're thinking, well, there's houses all up and down Guest Road. What has this got to do with the Eno? So, let's see here. There it is. Figure out how to get it to move here. Some of you may recognize this building. Some of you should hopefully recognize it very well. It's a great place because this is the office of the Eno River Association. I mean, this is a place where they do land conservation, they protect the cultural and natural history and just the American history that happened on the Eno. We have a great staff that works out of there. We've got a new executive director that's going to be working out of there. So this is that office, but it wasn't always this office. In fact, when I got to the Eno as the state park superintendent, Holger Nygaard, and hopefully a lot of you know that name Nygaard, and he was, one of the key figures in saving the Eno. Holger Nygaard called it the AIDS house. So what it was a hospice house, and I presume since Holger told me that, that served for AIDS patients at the time. And of course, back then, medications weren't like they were today where they could help out. But before it was the Eno River Association office, before it was a hospice house, it was the house of Ineva Tapp, and it was a private residence. So if you haven't been there at the association office, it sits on the northeast corner of the Guest Road Bridge, right on the river. The yard just trickles right down to the river. So it's a beautiful spot. They are right down on the river. So, talking about Betty Riley. So on a Friday night, February 26, 1988, Betty parked her car in the backyard. Lots of y'all do that too now just to access the trail there going back into West Point on the Eno and the Eagle Trail that starts there. She's 42 years old. She was a Durham neighbor. She lived not very far away, if anybody knows where Kirk Road was. And she was an administrative assistant at Neva's Rest Home on Coal Mill Road, which was owned by Ineva Tapp, who was the resident there at the house. As a matter of fact, it was Tapp's car, her boss's car, that Betty was driving, and she did that often. Now, she parked in there. It's nighttime. It's about 7, 8 o'clock at night. It's dark in February when you go back there, completely dark. There's no lights back there. She parked in the backyard, assuming she was alone. She was not. Someone shot her in the face and left her graveyard dead for the residents to find. Nobody was home at the time when she was bringing the car back. It wasn't long, though, before Ineva Tapp and some of the other residents there came. They found her laying face down in the yard. Now, it seems pretty straightforward at this point, but this is one of those wait, there's more stories. They did call the Durham County Sheriff's Office. This was before that was in the city limits. They found that the Plymouth that she had been driving, the engines and the lights were off, but the keys were still in the ignition. And of course, the family actually told them they were not expecting Riley that evening. So nobody knew that she was coming. They started a search of the area for evidence, including going back into the woods, which again, I said that's West Point on the Eno property back there. They didn't find a whole lot. So now uh, they were in the park late at night, got everybody out, everything's quieted down. They actually had the funeral 2 days later or 3 days later on Monday at Markham Memorial Garden in Durham. Now, here's where it starts getting a little weird. So before the funeral, the family and friends, they all gathered together at the home of Ineva Tapp's daughter, Brenda Riley. Now, remember, we're talking about Betty Riley that got killed. We're now at her daughter, at her boss's daughters, and her name is Brenda Riley. I want you to remember that name as this tale unfolds. Now, Brenda was not a blood relative of Betty, but they lived next door on Kirk Road. Now, it's going to get complicated. You just wait and see how complicated this is going to get. Now, the same day as the funeral, the sheriff's investigators announced they were looking for a man for questioning regarding the slaying. Now, they released this composite sketch, the one you're seeing here. This man had been acting suspiciously that Friday evening at Batten's Quick Stop. For those of you who've been around long enough, you'll remember Batten's was about a half mile up the Guest Road from where the Eno River Association office is. If you're going up the road, then on your left at the intersection of Umstead, it was a convenience store that was there for a long time up until they widened Guest Road a number of years back. Witnesses said this man was acting nervous. He was told the clerk to hurry up, wanted change for his $10 bill, and he bought a soda. He was looking out the window and he kept saying he had to go somewhere or meet someone. Now, this guy is described as 5'10", 6 foot tall, 180, 185 pounds, mustache, short hair, medium smooth complexion. All right, we'll look at the river while I tell you the rest of the story. All right, so Durham Sheriff's Office is a leading investigation. The lead investigator is Deputy Buchanan, Deputy R.D. Buchanan. They are looking for this. Well, 10 days after the murder, this thing took a twist. It really took an amazing twist. So we're talking about now Ineva Tapp. That was her house, backyard, her backyard where the murder took place. She was named as one of 4 people that an elderly couple had plotted to have murdered. So maybe this is related. So Crawford Blake, age 72, and his wife Valley Blake pled guilty that day in Durham court to the charge of solicitation to commit murder. These people lived in the Caroline Trailer Park. If you've been to the Cablelands access of the Eno River State Park. That's the trailer park that's right outside the parking area there at the Cablelands. They had, in June of 1987, the Blakes had offered $5,000 to a member of the Ku Klux Klan to kill four people that they believed were involved in the unsolved murders of their sons. Now, you think this is already twisted. We haven't even gotten to all the twists yet of this thing. So they offered this guy from the KKK to solve. Now, one of the sons was Crawford Blake Jr. He was murdered in 1985 at his home on Dumont Drive. Again, if you don't know that all of it about the Eno, Dumont Drive is in Orange County. It has a neighborhood access. It backs up to the Eno River State Park. It actually has a trail into the state park. Their other son, Larry Riley. So remember, we got Betty Riley, we've got Brenda Riley, now we've got Larry Riley. He was murdered in 1981 in Harnett County and left in a ditch. So the four people that were slated for revenge also included Brenda Riley. So Betty, the murder victim's next door neighbor, and where they one place where they'd all gather for the funeral. She was also, I need to tap Betty Riley. They were in the murder for hire plot, but there's more. All right, so Betty Riley, our murder victim, was the first wife of Larry Riley, the guy that was murdered in Harnett County. His second wife was Betty Riley. Excuse me, Brenda Brenda Riley, Betty's next door neighbor. I told you it gets complicated. So, so Aniva Tapp would have been the mother-in-law, the second mother-in-law of the Larry Riley who was murdered. So the Blakes blamed all these people for murdering their sons. Whether that was true or not, we don't know. Now, they wanted those people killed. So to move the murder plot along, they even went out and bought a shotgun for this member of the KKK. They picked him because they saw him at a KKK rally and they approached him. Here's what tripped up the whole plot. The guy wasn't KKK. He was a State Bureau of Investigation undercover agent. The one guy they picked out was the guy from the SBI. So they've got all this information now. This all comes out. Detective Buchanan from the Sheriff's Department is trying to investigate this, but he really doesn't know at this point. They don't know. Was this all part of the murder for hire plot? And so Betty Riley just happened to was targeted, or was she just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, or was it something else entirely different? They don't know. Was it all part of the vengeance or not? So this is February. All this is going on. Mid-March comes around. Durham Crime Stoppers is now offering a $1,200 reward for information leading to arrest in Betty's murder. They at that time posted the motive was undetermined, and then the case just went cold. I mean, even with all this information. And 4 years later, in 1992, there was an article in the News and Observer in Raleigh that the sheriff had a suspect. The Durham County Sheriff had a suspect, and they thought it was a contract killing, but there is no record existing in either the press or the Durham County Courthouse of any arrest in Betty Riley's murder, and that just leaves her wanting for justice. So, as you guys that are here on the Eno River Association staff are leaving that office in the dark of the night, don't want you thinking too much about Betty Riley and what happened there in the backyard. All right, going on from Betty Riley. Uh, this is a view from the bridge. I talked about Guest Road and where the office is, so I'm just going to lead right. It's just a great segue into it. This is actually looking from the bridge over Guest Road into the Eno River. I want to tell you three quick little stories about, because this bridge has got a notorious history, and I know a lot of you people drive over it all the time. So just some things to think about why you do it. First of all, right now, that bridge is a nice 5-lane. It's got guardrails. It's got guardrails that run up the sides so that you can't go around it. It's pretty darn safe to go over now. It was not always that way. So on May 24th of 1884, so over 100 years, or yeah, excuse me, yeah, well over 100 years ago, it was just a wooden bridge that went over the river, and it was about 20 feet high over the river. Now, you guys, you're not supposed to jump off bridges into the river. We've all seen those signs, especially if you go around Falls Lake. There's signs saying, no jumping or diving from the bridge. Nobody wants you to have any fun. We all know we shouldn't do that, but someone should have explained that to Frank Tilley's horse. So Frank and his friend, and I'm not making this up, his friend was known as R.A.T. Robertson. I don't know if they called him Rat Robertson or just R.A.T., but they were out for a ride in Frank's horse-drawn buggy. So they're crossing the Eno River on the bridge. And like I said, it's just no guardrails, nothing, and something spooked the horse. Those of us who are horseback riders know, oh, I see Jay Williams. Hey, Jay. Um, know that horses don't always like wooden bridges. So it may have just had something to do with the wooden bridge. It's hard to say, but something spooked it and it began to back up. So R.A.T., Rat Robertson, jumped off the wagon and tried to stop the horse. He caught him by the bridle, but he failed entirely. In an instant, the buggy went over the edge, throwing Frank out. So Frank's still over the side. The weight of the buggy pulled the horse over, and the jerk of the reins drew Robertson over. So Frank hit the river first. The buggy landed on Frank. The horse fell on the buggy, and Robertson landed on the horse. And there they were in all one big pile. Now, the river was rocky and shallow. You'd think people got hurt, but actually nobody, man nor equine, got hurt. I do not know how the buggy turned out. There was no record of that. But that's not the last time something happened. And that was probably the best circumstance that ever happened off that bridge. Again, poor Eno River Station staff, they're sitting here listening to this, and they have to drive over this bridge every day. Back in 1983, so coming up to modern times, on Tuesday, December 6th, it had been raining very heavily. In fact, more than 2 inches of rain had fallen overnight. And we all know what happens to the river when that happens. It swells up, it turns chocolate milk brown, it's rushing. In the morning, more than 2 inches had rained, and it was still pouring. It was pouring hard. Creeks are pumping water in the river at a furious pace. It keeps coming up. Now, the Eno River State Park rangers do watch the river levels for safety so they can let boaters, canoeists, kayakers know what the conditions are. And that's why Ranger Eric Nygaard was at the Guest Road Bridge about 10 o'clock in the morning. So I already mentioned a Nygaard once today. So yes, this is another Nygaard from the Nygaard family. Eric was the youngest son of Margaret and Holger Nygaard, or the youngest child. Good friend of mine for a long time. Those of you who don't know, Eric was twice stationed at the Eno River as a state park ranger. He also worked several other parks for the North Carolina State Parks before eventually retiring into the position that I went into. And actually, I followed him a couple of times. He worked for me when I was superintendent of Eno River, and then I worked for him when I was the superintendent of Hanging Rock, and he was the district superintendent. But on December 6th of 83, he was out checking the gauges that were painted on the bridges and also checking to see if any canoeists were launching. See, back in the summer when the river was low flow, he had painted gauges that indicated the foot depths of the river on three bridges, Pleasant Green, Cole Mill, and Guest Road. So he was out checking the levels so they could advise canoeists, and he was also comparing those gauges to see how they were reading to each other. He parked down on the south side, and he came down on the southwest side of the bridge. Now, this is, again, not the bridge y'all are seeing today. It was a two-lane bridge. It did have guardrails on the bridge, but it didn't have wings of guardrails sticking out from it. So a car could potentially go around it. As he's climbing down, he saw a car laying upside down on the riverbank down below, on the rocky shore right down below down there. So this is bad. This is really bad. And he knows that. Now, also, you got to know, back in the early 80s, we did not have radios assigned to every ranger. State parks didn't have enough money for everybody to have a radio. There were no cell phones. So before he did anything, he ran back up the bank, got in the road, stopped traffic, got a car that was in the southbound lane, told them to drive down the road to a phone and call for help. Then he headed back down the bank, and this is when things went from bad to heart pumping, adrenaline rushing worse. When he got down there, he found 18-year-old Brian Keith Tiffany pinned under the car. He was hurt bad, but the only thing that saved him was the roof of the car, which was over him and holding him down, had landed on a stump and was holding him up just enough where he wasn't completely crushed. So he was still alive. He had been there for more than 2 hours. He'd been there. His car, he had been heading north. His car hit a wet spot, skidded across the southbound lane, and hit the bridge abutment, rolled down the hill. He got thrown through the windshield, landed down there, and the car landed on top of him. It gets worse than that. The river was rising. He was only inches away from the water. If that water had not kept, if Eric had not found him, that river was going to engulf and drown him within hours. Fortunately, Eric was there. What Eric did was he shielded his face with best he could from the driving rain and just tried to reassure him while I waited for help. The highway patrol showed up, Durham EMS showed up, Lebanon Fire, volunteer fire department showed up, and a tow truck showed up. Because the only way they could save Tiffany was for the tow truck to get in the southbound lane and reach down and lift the car straight off of them where they could pull Mr. Tiffany out. Uh, this worked. They extricated him. Eric did say that the river was rushing so loud that the rescuers couldn't hardly even hear each other. They couldn't even talk to each other. But they got him out. He's taken to Duke Hospital. And though badly hurt, he did survive. Later today, he was in stable condition. I talked to Eric about this just this week, and he said in comment to it, you could say this was a typical day for a park ranger. And he's right. So, but like I said, a little bit tough, a little bit bad, but guys, it gets worse than that, this bridge. So 2 years later, 1985, driving north on Guest Road again, heading downhill. The bridge is still the same way it was before. Going way too fast was 19-year-old Timothy Clark. He was driving a 1976 Chevrolet Camaro. He lived just around the corner, for those of you familiar, Rosa Sharon Church Road. He was right from that area. In his passenger seat was 15-year-old Tammy Graves from Durham. And was a ninth grader at Carrington Junior High School. They reached the bridge at 12:26 p.m. And as they reached that Camaro veered left and took off and was going so fast, it hit the bridge and went airborne. And when I say airborne, it flew 89 feet, dropping 20 and clipping treetops and landed on the other side of the river. So I want to use my cursor here. And if you can see where I'm moving, that's where they landed over there. So they started on this side all the way across the river and landed over there. Now, Tammy Graves was actually ejected from the car, no seatbelt, ejected from the car as it flew in flight. The car landed, she landed it landed upside down. She landed on the car, and Clark was still in it. He was the driver. He was in there for more than an hour before Lebanon Fire Department cut him out. Car was demolished. Both the teams were rushed down to what was then Durham County General Hospital. You guys know it's Duke Regional now. Now, Clark, by Monday, this was on Saturday, he'd actually been upgraded to fair condition, but he actually spent more days in the hospital. Tammy Graves, the ninth grader, she lingered in critical condition for 9 days and she died. And her funeral was April 3rd. She's buried over at Oak Grove Memorial Gardens in Durham. Just a little bit more about your bridge there. So up here on the hill, what you can't see through the trees where these guys landed. At that time, that was the Eno River Association office. They call it the White House. It's a white cinder block building that they leased from the state park. But now, of course, we're across the road from where we're looking now over to our right. And that's where, of course, Betty Riley got murdered. So that's the Guest Road Bridge and its notorious history. And I'm sure many of you recognize this spot right here, the West Point Mill. And it's a beautiful spot. We love going there. The West Point Mill is probably the most successful and enduring mill of the 30 plus water mills that operated on the Eno. It was in commercial operation from 1778 to 1942. It went through a variety of owners, but on March 1 of 1852, it was owned by widow Rachel Sims and was called the Sims Sawmill. So most of the time it ground grain, but there were periods of history that it actually operated as a sawmill, which is what it was doing that March. The way it worked is the logs would ride on rails that carried it, and these were held up by sleepers. And these are important. There's these are horizontal timbers that are like cross ties on a railroad. Typically, those sleepers are 3 or 4 or more feet apart. So on this particular day, a 19-year-old mill employee by the name of Walter Proctor, who was a person to be known of good character, he was sitting astraddle one of the logs that was feeding into the sawmill. Now he was facing the saw blade so he could see it coming. And what he would do is he got too close to the saw blade, he would back up, scoot back on the log, continue facing it. He was chatting, and of course you guys hopefully know this, that most of the people that were doing the work back in those days weren't the people that owned the mills that had all the money. A lot of this was being run by the people they had enslaved, African American slaves. So he was actually chatting with one of those slaves who was a mill attendant. So they're sitting there talking. Walter's being careful. Every time he gets close to the blade, he scoots back. He scoots back. He never gets close to the teeth. He was never aware when he got to the end of the log, and he just scooted right off the back. And he fell right between the sleepers into what's called the pit. The pit is where all the gears and the giant belts are. The mechanics of the mill are running, and they're running fast. These are what all that stuff is turning. And you can go today when the mill's operating and see those kind of things happening. Now, the attendant did try desperately to grab him as he fell, but failed. And Walter fell down into it. The attendant ran over and jerked the handle to shut off all the lever, try to rob the machinery of all the power. It was too late. Walter was mangled. He was bruised. He died moments after being pulled out. He left very young. He left a mother, father, brother, and sister. And the Hillsborough Recorder called it the tragedy of melancholy accident. So when you visit the West Point Mill, please remember Walter. Please remember when the mill operators there tell you about the safety, that they really mean it, because this can really happen. For those of you who don't know, I should mention this just for the sake of the Eno River Association. The mill was in operation until 1942. It was restored and put back into operation in 1978, and that was a joint project of the Eno River Association and really driven by the Eno River Association and Durham Parks and Recreation. There we go. That's the West Point Mill. Okay. Hopefully some of y'all are familiar with the Riverwalk over in Hillsborough. You're thinking, oh, what a nice place to visit. Oh, it really is nice. And I really appreciate it. When my wife was wheelchair bound, that was nice because she could actually go out and we could hike the river on the Riverwalk. It's amazing that came together. I watched that during my career come together, and I was just amazed. But actually, we're going to talk about the cannons that were found in the Eno River right here at the trestle that goes over the Eno. And now understand how the cannons ended up in the river. You have to go back to 1862. General Beauregard of the Confederate Army sent out a call for cannon making metal. And so Captain William Badham sent his lieutenant to Edenton, North Carolina. And I'm hoping I'm saying Badham's name right. I really don't know how it's pronounced. But he sent him to Edenton, which was Badham's hometown, to ask the churches to donate their bells to be melted down to make cannons for the Confederacy. And all the churches in Edenton gave their bells except for the Baptists. For some reason, the Baptist church, their people objected. We don't know whether it was because there was some objection to the war or objected to just losing their bells. We don't know. And besides the churches, the courthouse, an academy, and 2 shipyards gave their bells as well. All those bells were taken to and I hope I'm saying this right, the Tregeter Iron Works in Richmond, and they were cast into 4 cannons, and those cannons were sent back to the company of Captain Badham. And most of his people in his company were from Edenton. They became known as the Edenton Bell Battery Company. They saw a lot of action in the eastern halves of Virginia and North Carolina. And then just as the war was coming to an end, Captain Badham was afraid that the cannons would fall into the hands of the Union Army. So as their train was crossing this bridge, well, this is the newer bridge, but the bridge that existed at the time, the railroad trestle at the time, as they were crossing that with their cannons in the train, they secretly push their cannons over into the river. And people, you say, well, the river's so shallow, surely you would see the cannons. But you got to remember there were a lot more mills on the river that day. And so there were a mill that backed the water up there. It was actually much deeper at that time and stayed deeper for a while. So you wouldn't have seen it. Well, so those things lay in the water for probably 30 years, roughly. And I'll tell you why I don't know exactly here in a minute, but they were discovered by some Duke students. And being Duke students, they decided the best thing to do with those cannons is pull them out, clean them up, stuff them with gunpowder, and see if they'll shoot. And they stuffed them to the neck with black powder and they gave them a shot for old time's sake. The powder charge was so heavy, what they did was blow up a cannon and it exploded all the heck. And, several of these adventurers were injured. Luckily, no one died. But to tell you the truth, they were not the only ones to do this because after the Civil War, people were finding cannons all the time. And there's constant newspaper reports of people blowing up cannons and getting injured and dying. Now, I wanted to tell you this story to tell you a little bit more about the book itself. So when I was researching the book, I found the story about the Duke students, and it was very specific, when it happened and where and all that, so who was involved. I found that story. I have some vague memory of thinking I would be coming back to it. I found that before I found out where the cannons came from. I found that information later. So I found out found out where the cannons came from and how they got in the river. But then I couldn't find my article that told me about the Duke students. So I lost that. And I will tell you, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to find that story again. And I never did. And so I really regret that. And I apologize because I can't give you those details. I just know that I remember it was sometime around the 1890s and have to be after 1892 because that's when Duke University moved to Durham. All right. That's a picture of me when I was a ranger. And I usually didn't try to get my picture taken without my ranger hat, which I was notorious for not wearing when I should, but I always try to get my picture taken. Somehow somebody from the Durham Press got that picture, and I don't know why I let them get it without my hat. But I'm going to watch our time a little bit, but I want to tell you this story, and you can read more detail about it in the book. But I'm going to give you the general gist of it because this is a bad one here. So in February of 2000, Ranger Joe Martin and I were closing up the park. Back then, the state park gates locked at 6 p.m. I was closing Occoneechee Mountain State Natural Area. Joe was closing the main Eno River State Park. At 6 o'clock, as he was trying to get the gate shut, he still had a maroon Honda in the parking lot there at Fuse Ford. So you guys probably recognize this. That's the Wilderness Cabin. A lot of people know it as the O'Brien Cabin. Across the river from the Eno Trace hiking trail there at the Fuse Ford access of the state park. So the car's still there. Joe put a note on it, went and closed everything up, came back, started looking. I came back from Occoneechee Mountain. Our standard procedure back in those days was we would do several things. Well, first we would try to run the tag and get a name and an address, which we did. Back then, the cell phones were starting in 2007. Cell phones were pretty common. Before cell phones, we would look in the phone book, find the person's name, get their phone number, and call them and see if they were really, if there was a reason they left their car. And most of the time there was a reason. It wasn't like they were really in any kind of trouble. Well, this person didn't have a listing in the phone book, so we didn't have that. We checked heavy use common areas for an hour and a half that evening, didn't find the owner. Her name was Miriam Lee, and we didn't find her. So we left a note with instructions on what to do. And because our standard procedure was we had no evidence at all that anybody was in trouble. And it was common that people, even though they weren't supposed to, they would leave cars. We wouldn't do anything more after that. So we had more evidence. Ranger Martin was back on duty the next morning. Very early in the morning, two neighbors that live right outside the park gate there at Fuse Ford walked in and went to go hiking on the Eno Trace Trail. They hiked down the steps to the river. There used to be a little bridge just to the right of the trail that goes over a spring branch. It's gone now. It was taken out just a few years ago. When they got down to that bridge, they found a set of women's clothing neatly folded and sitting on that bridge, along with shoes and jewelry, including a watch, just sitting there, very neatly placed there. So they immediately knew this was not normal. They went and found Ranger Joe Martin, and he called me, and we knew we had something at that point. We shifted into high gear. I sent Martin to the address that we had with the car to find out what's going on. I went to the state park office to set up an incident command post. And I'm telling you what, you realize how big Eno River State Park is when you need to now find one single person out in there. So we started looking for this person. What we found out from her parents, which were at her house, Miriam was 19 years old, and at 5 o'clock the evening before, she had left work crying and had not come home. So we know this much about her. We also figured out a timeline that she had no time to pick anybody else. She had just time to drive straight out to the park based on when Joe had first seen her car, which is before closing time. So it was a very short time from work to get there. We needed help. We needed trained help, and this is what a lot of people don't understand about search and rescue. It's not just a matter of looking for somebody. It's getting people who know what they're doing that won't make things worse. But we did get help. We got help from Umstead and Falls Lake State Parks, Orange County Emergency Management, the Rescue Squad, the Sheriff's Department, Durham Fire Department. We got help from 3 volunteer search and rescue teams that are trained, 3 swift water teams, the State Bureau of Investigation. We had 72 people out there looking for Mary. Martin brought Miriam's stepfather to the office. He had the key to the car. I sent Ranger Christopher Ammons over the car to search it. He found some writings in a notebook that Miriam had done that showed she was despondent over a boy. Now, she didn't say she was going to hurt herself, but it was obvious, we could tell from her state of mind, she was upset. When we've had people that are despondents lost in the parks before, which is not uncommon that they come in and unfortunately some of us want to harm themselves, we usually find them on land. So that's what we did. We did a really concentrate, especially that morning, on getting the land searches around the river, around the clothes, where the clothes are found, going and on the trails. Miriam's mother also showed up and did just the absolutely wrong thing. She meant well, but she just couldn't stand it. She went out on the trails looking for Miriam, which meant we didn't have her there where we could ask her questions that might help us find Miriam. Also, then we had to worry about what was going to happen to her. Um, Now, I did call in 3 swiftwater rescue teams. And while teams were out searching the riverbanks and the woods and the trails, to be thorough, we put them in the river. We put a team called Reds out of Raleigh down at the Cave Ford access, Cave Ford Road, and at the Cave Ford working upstream. We put the South Orange Rescue Squad Swiftwater team in right there at the Eno Trace Trail, right where the clothes are found, working downstream. And we also had a crew coming from Youngsville that was going to start at the swinging bridge and work upstream. But at 3:25, Orange Rescue Squad, and let's see here, there we go. There's Orange Rescue Squad. So they're South Orange Rescue Squad working the river. And the way they were working it was they had boats floating in the river, but they had divers out in the river searching the bottom. So they're out there searching. Well, at 3:25, they radioed they had found Miriam. She was 220 yards downstream from where her clothes were left, just past. So the Eno Trace Trail turns uphill right about here. She was just past that. They were doing it, and this guy, what's really happening in this photograph? That diver is over her right now. And I'm not going to show you the body or anything like that, but he's over her right now. She lay on the bottom in 4-foot deep water. She had likely been in the river since it got dark the night before. We sent rangers to secure the scene, and my supervisor, who's Billy Totten, who, by the way, just put on a conservation easement of his property to the Eno River Association last year. But my supervisor and I had to go tell Miriam's mother, who was at that point in the picnic area parking lot. Her mother desperately wanted to see the body, but we wouldn't let her because at this point the body had been in the mud and muck, and she just really didn't need to see her like that till she was cleaned up. So they got down there, and eventually she was pulled out, placed in a yellow body bag, and she was rolled out of the river on this stretcher right here, and that's it. Rangers and rescue squad personnel moving her out of it. She was taken to the medical examiner in Chapel Hill. They did an autopsy the next day. They did determine she died from drowning. There was no evidence of a crime. That they did toxicology screens. Took several weeks for them to come back. No alcohol in her system. No drugs in her system. This means that somehow Miriam walked out into the river in February with temperatures in the 30s with rocks all, you know how the Eno is, there's rocks all at the bottom. So that's exaggerating the pain on her feet. And one of two things happened. She either held herself underwater until she drowned, or she sat in the water until she had hypothermia and just passed out. But she was doing it in water that she could stand up in. This was not water over her head. It just took a remarkable determination to do that. And you say, well, man, how can somebody drown themselves in the river? She was not the first. You have to read the book to find out the first. This is not the first time that had happened. Um, so her parents, I want to go back one slide. There we go. Her parents were very gracious. They wanted her to be remembered, and they actually donated a bench that sat right here on the riverbank for many years. It's a very unique bench. It's very well crafted. And so this sat there for years, but the river kept coming up and flooding over it and threatening it. So eventually, several years ago, the Rangers removed it and they put it on the deck of what's now the old office, but still the Rangers office. So if you go up to use those restrooms or go in to see the Rangers, you can still see that. This was before we were allowed to put names on donations saying where they came from. But that is Miriam's bench. And so please remember her when you see her or you're hiking on the Eno Trace Trail. So Eli, I know the time is going. I've got one more short story. Do you want me to tell it, or do you want to give people time to comment and ask questions?
I think that's up to you. It's your call. I'm happy to go either way. We have a couple questions in the chat, but if folks want to hang out a little bit longer, I'm getting some comments saying tell it. Um,
Okay, well, it's a ghost story. I don't want to scare two people too bad. You got to go sleep tonight. But all right, I got a ghost story for you.
okay.
Now, I will tell you, there are several ghost stories in the book. They are all based on authentic events. So they're not like made up ghost stories or anything like that. I'll let you decide whether ghosts are real or not. And I'll give you my opinion at the end of this. But this story was called Little Girl Ghost, happened in 1966. So a lot of you are familiar if you hike the Buckporter Creek Trail at the Fuse Ford access of the state park or the Ridge Trail. Right there at the intersection is the Anthony Cole House. When the leaves are off the trees, you can see it from the trails, and a lot of people walk up there to see it. In the springtime, the daffodils are blooming. It's very pretty. If you look at that house is so old, it was built, well, again, it was built, but you can actually still see the axe hewn, it's axe log or hewn logs. You can still see the axe marks in it. If you go and look inside, which you're not supposed to do, but if you look up at the tin roof, you can actually still see the old wooden shake shingles under the tin roof. They're still there. It's called the Anthony Cole House. Anthony never lived there. He built it for his son Thomas around 1850. The last occupant was Grover Cleveland Shaw, who sold a considerable amount of land for the creation of the state park. Shaw bought it to protect it and preserve it, and the house served as like a retreat for him. He didn't lock it up or anything, but he would come there to the Eno quite often from Randolph County, and he was very happy to sell that land to the state park. When I got there in 93, the house was deteriorating. The kitchen in the back had already collapsed. Excuse me, I need to pop up. By the way, I meant to show y'all that. There's a picture of Miriam Lee right there. I'm sorry, I got excited about telling the story and forgot to show you that picture of her from her obituary. All right, there's the Anthony Cole house. So the kitchen used to be here in the back, and you can see some collapsed structure. That was the kitchen, and that's important to the story. And this is the house. I've been watching it deteriorate for more than 30 years now. It was better, and it's getting worse all the time. So after Shaw sold the place in State Park, the only occupants after that have been the black vultures that nest. They actually still nest upstairs. They raise their young up there, and flying squirrels, as far as I can tell. So in 1966, Mark Cole Jr., so remember this is Cole, and came out to see the birthplace of his father. His father was born here 90 years earlier in 1876. Now, he only lived there a few years before he moved to Cary. Now, the house was owned by Grover Cleveland Shaw at the time. It was still safe to go into, wasn't locked. The kitchen was still standing. So Mark went inside the big house there, and he took a photograph looking through into the doorway of the kitchen. At the time he took the picture, he thought of nothing remarkable, nothing at all. He went and had the picture developed and printed, and that's when he got the surprise. After he got it, there's a transparent girl standing in the kitchen. It's a color photograph. she's in color. Her clothes are in color. Now she is transparent, but she's sort of floating in the dark interior of the kitchen. Now, Cole didn't believe in ghosts, and he thought it might be some light on the chimney. Though to add a little strangeness to it, he actually has another photograph of his father standing in a group of people from 1890. This is when the photograph was taken. And there is a little girl in that picture, 8 to 10 years old, that looks remarkably like the floating image in the photograph he took inside the house there. He got that 1890 photo from his father's sister. Now, I have seen a reprint of the actual photograph, and it looks for all the world like there's a little girl in there. In 1985, the Durham Sun newspaper actually ran a black and white image of the photograph, and it's just not good. I mean, this was what ran in the paper. It just doesn't print good black and white. You can't see the colors, and it doesn't look as real. But that's the photograph from 1985 that was put into the paper. When now Mark Cole actually brought this image for us to see. That's how I got to see this. But he brought it to us in the 1990s. We were technologically insufficient at that time. We had no way to copy it or even take a digital photo of it or anything back at that time. So we didn't get a copy of it. And Eric Nygaard has told me he has a copy of it, but he has, last when I asked him about it, he couldn't find it. So we haven't seen that either. Now, I don't particularly believe in ghosts, but I have been at that house even at night on multiple occasions. And in fact, one night I took my Cub Scouts. I was a Cub Scout leader, and I took them up there in the dark in October. And sure enough, we're standing around that house, and sure enough, something swooped down and flew down and landed right in front of us. But it was a flying squirrel. It wasn't a ghost. So if you like ghost stories, you can think about that. You're not supposed to be there at night, but I suppose if you're legally camping in the campground, you could walk out there at night and see if you see a ghost. All right, so those are the stories I have for you. I do want to say this: if you come to the fireside campfire program in April, it will be completely different stories. I'll have completely different stories for you at that time, so I won't bore you if you come to both. And that's me as the education director of the Eno River Association. And so, Eli, what questions have you got?
Yeah, I've got a couple here in the chat. I know that Clint Smith has been waiting very patiently to get a couple questions answered. Let me go back here. So the first one is Clint is wondering if you have ever seen a photograph of the Guest Road grist mill, which operated for 85 years under one name or another from 1848 to 1933, because he has never seen one, and it was built by his ancestor, William Warren Guess, in
Ah,
1840.
yes, Squire Guess. So no, I have never seen a photograph of it. However, there are multiple stories about the Guess mill site and some things that have happened there in Dark Tales of the Eno River. But no, I wish I could say I'd found a photograph, but I've never seen one.
And one more question from Clint. West Point on the Eno was owned by his great grand uncle George Carrington
Yeah.
from 1798 to 1817. He was the most prolific building owner, uh, prolific, its most prolific owner in 1798. Built it. What do you know about the demolished home that was so sadly unsaved?
I'm the wrong person to ask. That would probably be something I would ask some of the people that are involved with Durham history, and I don't know anything about the demolished home. Yeah, there was a lot. In fact, there was even plans not to just demolish everything there on the site when Durham took it over as a park. And thanks to the Eno River Association, some of the buildings were saved. And we do have a ghost story regarding the McCowan Mangum House in Dark Tales as well. But no, I'm afraid I can't tell you anything about those buildings. That was before my time. In fact, I would have been probably a teenager back when that was all going on. So I don't know too much about it. Um, see, I had another thought on that, though, I was going to add, and it'll come back to me. What other questions you got?
Another person is wondering if the book covers the long dance murder of the nursing student and her boyfriend.
Yes, yes, it does. For those of you who don't know, that actually that murder occurred on what is now the boundary line of the Eno River State Park and the Cave Lands access of the state park. I do not cover it in as detail. You could write a very long book about it. There is a podcast, and it is noted in the book. If you're intrigued by that story, there is a podcast about it, the Valentine's dance murders, and which still remain technically unsolved, though there were suspects. But that is in the book.
All right. Jay Williams is wondering who lived in the sister's house, Anthony's or Thomas' sister.
I think that would have probably been Thomas's, but tell you what, Jay, I've never known. One of the truths of history is that when people are just living, they don't realize it's history and they just don't write things down. And you know, it's a reason for documenting. And let me tell you, this is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'm not going to make any money off of it. I'm going to lose money off of it just from all the time, energy, and gas and everything else of researching and writing and everything. But I didn't want the stories to get lost. That was a primary thing. So Dark Tales is, if anything else, it's a history book. Now, I try to tell the stories in the book like I would if we were sitting around a campfire. I hope that they're entertaining. I hope that they mean something to you. I will tell you, if you're a lover of the Eno, which I think everybody here is, if you're a visitor of the Eno and you know places, you're going to recognize the spots. I make sure you're clear on where this is happening, so that when you're visiting the Eno, it all relates to you and you can relate to the stories and these people. And even though there are a lot of victims and there's a lot of deaths, there's a lot of death in this book. These are people that they need to be remembered. They were real people, and they don't need to be forgotten. And so, and I tried to make sure all the victims were treated with respect and dignity. But they're fascinating stories. I will tell you, they are not all the deaths that happened on the, they're not all the tragedies or disasters. I had to take some out again because of length of the book. There were a couple that editorially I decided, that were just too much. We just couldn't put them in the book. They were just too much. One of the stories I told you today, the one about Mr. Tiffany that Eric Nygaard found under the car, that's not in the book. That's one. One of the truths is I knew once I got this out, more stories would pop up. And so last week, Eric Nygaard got up with me and told me that story. And I said, well, I'm going to write it down and keep it just so it doesn't get lost. What else you got there, Eli?
Well, we got a couple more here. Somebody's wondering what you know about the unmarked cemetery above Holden Mill, where only a marker for Veazey or Beasley.
Yeah, well, I probably don't know too much more than what's on the marker. So, the Mark Chilton, the Orange County registrar, has done a little research. So there had been oral history. So for those of you who don't know, there is a cemetery that has at least 15 graves up above the Holden Mill cabin site, a few hundred yards west of there. And there's one marked grave. It has a temporary marker on it. So, that's what they put on the grave before they put a headstone up. It has lasted since 1942. It's still readable, but no permanent markers on there. So it's Norman Veazey is the name on it, but the neighborhood oral history was always that was not Norman Veazey. That was Norman Beasley, who was the caretaker for the old hunt club that was up there. And the hunt club site, the hunt club is, you can't see the building anymore. The chimney is still standing if you know where to look for it near the old tobacco barn up there. And so we think that was Norman Beasley, who was born, I want to say, in 1778, but it was right around there because there is a death certificate for him with Orange County. And one of the key things, the state park actually had archaeologists up in that area within the last year and looking over the site. I don't know what much more is going to happen. A couple of things that need to happen is that cemetery needs to get registered with state Office of Archaeology, and they have a system for doing that. It requires somebody going out there and doing some elementary surveying, taking pictures, and submitting the forms and everything. So, but like I said, there was just depending on who you talk to. But basically, there was some thought that the funeral home, they're still active, They buried my wife, so I have good feelings for them. But back then in the 40s, there was such prejudice and disregard for anybody that was African American that they just were real careless about the name and they put the wrong name on the marker. I wouldn't. That's what I was going to mention too, and it goes back to the question we had about the mill names and everything. I'll mention another project that's going on. Hillary's involved with it. Is and Joe Lyles and I and several other people on the Eno staff and volunteers, and that's the Eno Place Names Project. We have tried to find as many historical names for locations, whether it's a rock formation, an old building site, creeks, all kind, just tons of things, dams, whatever, hundreds of names that we didn't want to get lost because over time people forget these names were there. And so, what the association is trying to produce is online maps where you could go online and it's all in GIS, and you can say, okay, I'd like to see the names of the rock outcrops on the river. And so, where is Lover's Leap? You know, there's a rock outcropping called Lover's Leap. And where is that one? And you can bring them up and you have a key to find where those are. And it goes back to the cemeteries as well. So, you know, like we have all the cemetery locations and what names we can find for them. That's a project we have going on just so we don't lose these places and their names. What else you got?
Yeah, we got two or three more. I don't know how much time you have, but happy to go through these with you.
I'm
Um,
good on times.
okay, great. So Dane is wondering if you know if the tree where the long dance bodies were found still stands.
I think I identified that tree, but it's blown over because there was a description. And so the area where the bodies were found was very young forest for the most part and has since grown up into small pines, small hardwoods, but they were tied to a large oak tree. And right in the vicinity of the R, there was only really one or two big oak trees. And you also have to think back to how long it's been. So we're talking about, was that 71? And so, you know, that's we've got a lot of years, they're over 50 years. So you got to look at the tree growth. So I really think it's the one that's blown over is the one that they were tied to.
All right. Another question. Nancy is wondering about the deaths at the Eno Quarry, if you know anything
Yeah,
about that.
sure. Those are covered in the book. All the ones so far are covered in one section of the book. There's been four. And I was present for three, you know, in response to three of them. And so yes, they're covered. And the first one was in 1993. And I apologize, I can't, it's Brian. I'm drawing a blank on the last name. But yeah, they're each covered. All of them young men, none of them under alcohol or drugs. My theory is on most of them overexertion. You know, they get out there swimming. A lot of times they may not have been swimming in a while and they take extra muscles. The first one was the longest one to recover in that he was not recovered right away. And in search and rescue, we call it limited continuous um, search, which is a way of training essentially. The way he was found was we kept bringing dive teams out there over several months. And at that point, the quarry wasn't even the state parks. It was Orange County Emergency Management bringing them out. And it was another North Carolina team from the eastern part of the state. The diver was literally skimming across the bottom, and the bottom has so much sediment around it when you swim down there. In places it's 60 feet deep. That's the deepest it is, but it stirs up the sediment, so you can't really see. So he's feeling, and he actually put his hand down in a crevice down there and felt the body. The body was refrigerated. It's very, very cold. And so even though he had been down there over a month, he was still in good condition for his burial. But yeah, those are covered in the book.
Couple more for you. Grant is wondering about the old cars that you can find along the Eno, and if you have any interesting stories about any of those.
They're not about the ones off the Dunnigan Trail. They look like to me that they were abandoned demolition derby cars. I mean, that's just what I mean, not just because they're beat up. They literally look like that's what they were used for. So have known about them for years. There's actually some pieces of old cars up Rocky Creek as well. And then, of course, they have stationed some there at Occoneechee Speedway. I did have two stories about the Okanichi Speedway initially in the book, but they got cut because the History Press wanted to keep the book to a certain length. So sorry about that.
There's also we just did another one of these virtual lunch and learns last month about the history of the Okanichi Speedway. So that's on the YouTube channel. Feel free to check that out. A couple more here. Somebody's wondering if you have the cemetery on the Cox Mountain Trail on your left side on your way to Fanny's Ford, if you know anything.
I don't, we've never had a name for it. It is included on our Eno place names as a location, but we just don't know much about it. If you pay attention when you're hiking the Cox Mountain Trail, you'll see you're on an old, very old roadbed. It was part of the old Hillsborough Coach Road, and you can actually see that there's a former road that went up around what's now the cemetery. If you pay attention, it's overgrown with big trees, but it's there. And that was, of course, so people could pull their wagons off of the main road, which, that's using the term loosely main road. It's one lane there, but this was horse and wagon days. And so you could get off for if a funeral was being held. We don't know. There's a few field stones, but we don't know whether that's a slave cemetery. We don't know if it's early settlers, mixture of both. Nobody knows. We do know the cemetery right behind. Those of you who don't know, there's a cemetery right behind the Fuse Ford picnic area, and that is the Piper Cemetery. There's no marked grave. You can just see the depressions.
I see one final question in here, and that's somebody is wondering about the Devil's Sinkhole and why it's called
Mhm.
that.
Uh, I did not find any references to why it was called the Devil's Sinkhole. There is a story about it. The only drowning that I found that dealt with the Devil's Sinkhole, I have swum in the Devil's Sinkhole. There's a picture of me in the book swimming in the Devil's Sinkhole because I was measuring it. It was at its deepest a little over 9 feet deep. But no, I don't know. There was also a second story I wanted to include in the book about somebody that faked their death at the Devil's Sinkhole, but that one got cut as well. So sorry that one didn't get included. But we kept the one about the actual drowning that did happen there, which happened about a year before the Great Flood that wiped out not all, but a great many of the mills on the river. It's a
Oh,
beautiful spot. It's very difficult to get to. I should caution y'all about Devil's Sinkhole. Everybody gets intrigued by it. It is a beautiful spot. The North Bank is private property. They are not welcoming to people coming through there without permission, and they're not going to advertise who to get permission from. To get there from the South Bank side, that is through the Eno River State Park. There are no trails there. It's about 3+ miles from the parking lot at Fuse Ford. So you need to be handy at navigating off trail to get to it.
all right. Let's see. I didn't see any more. It looks like there's maybe one or two more quick
Okay.
questions. You got time? Or
Yeah.
all right. Clint is wondering what you know about the newly found Dumont Road enslaved cemetery that maybe Beverly Scarlett. Uh,
That's the same one I was referencing earlier for the Holden Mill cabin. That's the exact same one.
okay.
And I wouldn't call it newly discovered. We've known about it for quite a while. It's just it's more people are finding out about it.
All right. And this will be our last question. Grant is wondering if there's any way to get the stories that got cut from the book.
So if you come to, I'll give you two ways to get those stories. That's a good question. So on March the 12th, I will be doing a reading for Purple Crow Books in Hillsborough. I'll actually be doing it at the Thomas Stevens Art Gallery across the street. I'm going to bring copies of the 18 stories that were cut and give them out to anybody that shows up there because I don't want those stories to get lost. I will also be doing that for the April event out at the Confluence when we do the campfire program. Of course, that's a limited one, so you have to sign up for that whenever it gets posted. But I'll have them there too. And then I'm hoping that the Eno River Festival invites me to come be at the festival and work up at the big top selling books and posters. I might have them there too.
Oh yeah, we'll have to talk to Brian. We can get you in
Yeah.
touch with him. Well, thank you so much, Dave. I'm going to end the recording here. Um, whoop. I don't want to end the meeting.